Hello colleagues and welcome to this webinar on the Ofsted review into sexual abuse in schools. My name is Lewis Donald, I'm the Director of Safeguarding for Stowe Valley Multi-Academy Trust, and we decided as a trust that as we work hard towards developing a whole mat strategy for responding to peer-on-peer abuse, sexual violence, harassment, online violence and assault in all forms, that it's important that we give our governors, our local and governing bodies, our members and our trustees an opportunity to reflect on the report itself. What did the report tell us? What can we take from it? And what is it that we need to do next? I want to start by taking you back to March 2021. We were just about coming out of the second or third lockdown. Schools were starting to reopen up. But what was ticking along in the background was this conversation around the Everyone's Invited movement. The Everyone's Invited movement, if you aren't aware, was a project set up by a lady called Saka, and her role really was to develop a platform for young girls and women to come forward and talk about their experiences of sexual abuse, both in schools, universities and colleges. The website itself, accessed through Google, has seen a massive uptake in the amount of testimonials that have been added to it, the amount of conversations that are taking place around it, and also the different kind of pathways of support that are emerging as a result of it. Today, 51,000 testimonials have been submitted to the website, which captures well over 25% of education settings within the country, and I imagine that that number will continue to grow. Now, the Everyone's Invited movement in itself, whilst it wasn't just an opportunity for women and young girls to come forward and talk about their experiences, it was also a wake-up call for the government and its associated departments to reflect on sexual abuse in schools. And it was as a result of that that the Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson, decided back in March 2021 that he wanted to commission Ofsted to undertake a review of sexual abuse in schools and higher education. And the Secretary of State asked that 4 key questions be answered. Firstly, is there sufficient guidance on how schools deal with sexual violence? Is the relationship working between the schools and their own processes for referrals into the police? And what does that kind of collaborative working look like when referrals are made? Thirdly, if inspectors are currently looking at the issue in the right way. And finally, if schools are appropriately teaching the RSHE curriculum. What we'll do is, as we go through this, we'll dive into each question in a little bit more detail so we can understand what their findings and recommendations were. But to give you some kind of the headline result in each area, if you will, turning to the first question, which was around that topic of guidance and on how schools deal with sexual violence, the Ofsted found that generally, yes, there was a gap in how schools should respond to sexual violence. And it also raised the point that schools recognised that particularly when lengthy investigations were taking place or where prosecutions had been instigated and there'd been no conviction or a non-guilty verdict, that schools really struggled with knowing exactly what they should be doing, what role they should take on, and what support they should provide to young people in those scenarios. Secondly, as I say, they looked at whether the relationship was working between schools and the way in which they make referrals into the police. Again, it firmed up their first finding, really, which was to say that they recognised that schools said that it was difficult to make effective decisions when police investigations were ongoing. And I think this really was in recognition that the police act at a far slower pace through the nature of their work than we in schools do. And school leaders spoke in some of the visits that took place about their own frustrations around seeing this child day in, day out and wanting to provide a level of support, but not having that broader awareness of the challenges around the criminal justice system and how long those investigations were potentially taking. Thirdly, as I say, they were asking, the inspectorate almost looked in on itself really and self-reflected on its own practices in this area and decided that actually there was a bit of a case both ways, that yes, they were looking at this area in visits, but on many an occasion, inspectors were not following up the data and the information that they were being provided as a result of their pupil voice exercises, or also the data that they were provided at the start of the day. And then finally, they were looking at whether or not schools are appropriately teaching the RSE curriculum. And they said, Ofsted's found essentially that those who are non-specialists in that area lacked confidence, especially when it came to the content that they were delivering. And I think as we would all relate to, is that where that specialist kind of confidence isn't there and there isn't that clear understanding of what it is they should be delivering, the content that was actually being shared with our young people across schools, higher education settings, was completely inconsistent. And it was also inconsistent with the actual experiences that young people have out in the community and within different contexts. It wasn't accurately capturing what it is like and what the experiences are of a young person in 2021. So as I say, the Secretary of State said that they wanted Ofsted to undertake this review, and that review then was launched in April this year. They went and visited a range of different schools. They visited the schools. They spoke to school leaders. They spoke to parents, pupils, but they also spoke to settings like children's social care and a range of other partners as well to get a feel for what the current kind of state of the union is around sexual abuse in school. And they made a range of kind of recommendations that the government have acted on immediately. And some of the to give you a feel for the general kind of response of the government in this area, the government have said in response that they need to encourage schools more to dedicate inset time for sexual violence, sexual harassment, and the teaching of RSHE. They said that they're going to continue to fund the NSPCC helpline up until October. They haven't really specified whether that's the beginning of October or the end of it, but it's certainly going to continue to fund it. They've said they're going to work with tech companies on prevention of online harm. They're going to be clearer in RSE curriculum advice around sharing of images online and the associated question of consent. They're going to use more appropriate language and using language that pupils recognise within statutory guidance. And finally, they're going to support over 500 DSLs as they look to branch out the current support trial that they're doing around supervision, where essentially a social worker provides some a level of supervision to DSLs within schools. So that's what the government did. Let's now turn to the actual report itself. As I say, Ofsted visited 32 schools. They spoke to over 900 teenagers, and the way in which they picked these schools, and of course we know that Bilton were visited as part of this review, they didn't, the way they picked these schools was a bit of a mixture. Some of the schools had been mentioned on the Everyone's Invited website, others weren't. Essentially, regions were asked to identify some schools where they've either seen some really good practice, where they may have had some concerns about the school, or where, as I say, they've been found to be on this website. And those 32 schools were pulled out. The schools visited, and as part of that day, they would look at the way the curriculum was taught, have a look at some cases in that area, and speak to some staff and young people as well to get an understanding of young people's experiences in this area. As I mentioned a moment ago, they conducted some focus groups specifically with multi-agency partners. They spoke to victims groups and they spoke to parents of young people as well, trying to capture the broadest possible view they could in this area. They also had a look at the Everyone's Invited website and reviewed some of the testimonials, and they also reviewed the literature that's available to school leaders as well to get a feel for what was out there and what was available to DSLs. Now, if you haven't already seen the report, that literature review at the end of the report provides a fantastic reading list in terms of developing and upskilling in this area, your general knowledge on sexual abuse in schools. So what have we learned from the Ofsted review into sexual abuse in schools then? Firstly, we've learned that it's worse than most adults thought. It's something that happens, it's prevalent in communities, it's prevalent on school corridors, and it is prevalent in the lives of our young people, even if we do not have the data to back that up. Young people told Ofsted that sexual harassment and online sexual abuse is so common that it isn't reported. We've got to that point which we feared, where actually young people are normalizing this behavior now, and as a result of that aren't feeling it's even necessary to make a report into school leaders, into the police, and so on. Something that came out of the focus groups with young people, girls in particular, are regularly sent explicit images from boys. We're going to have a look at that data in a bit more detail in a moment, but that was a key headline really for me in that area. They said that some young people thought it was acceptable to ask someone for a nude picture, but that the image shouldn't be shared further. The young people in this report that were spoken to were almost saying that they felt that it was normalized. It was okay to share a picture. The issue came when that picture was shared on beyond the initial people that were engaged in that sharing of imagery. In terms of how the perceptions of boys and girls differed, the report found that was quite clear, really. They said that boys often talked about jokes and compliments and how things was banter, whereas girls would describe things as routine name calling, sexual comments and objectification. And there was a real clear distinction in the way that the two genders looked at that, if you will. So let's have a look at some of the data that came out of this review then. This first table shows a piece of data around sexual harassment and violence. And the question was around either do these things happen a lot or sometimes between people of my age. And if we look across, we can see straight away that these things are happening a lot to our girls in all areas, really. We in all areas see that girls are significantly more likely to be affected by this than boys in terms of becoming being sent indecent images, being subject to unwanted touching, being pressured to do sexual things, or being the victim of rumours about sexual activity or subject to sexual name calling. And that imbalance and shift towards girls being the victim of this is seen as well when young girls were talked and boys were spoken to about the sharing of still images and videos. As we can clearly see here again, that girls again significantly or disproportionately more likely to be affected or to have been sent unwanted images, being pressured into sending images, or had images shared about them that they didn't even know existed. For me, that data is a real kind of headline for me that you can see that we need to focus our attention and recognize that girls are more likely to be the victims, but it shows as well that boys are not immune from this as well. We can see in all areas that just under or just over 50% of our boys have been subject to harm in these areas. And we must not forget that as we look to develop our whole school approaches in this area. The report also told us that sexual violence typically happens in unsupervised places outside of schools. Young people told inspectors that some incidents do occur on crowded corridors and school buses. And for me, that was a real big kind of reminder around the importance of when we speak to designated safeguarding leads about their safeguarding practice, how often do we ask the question around what they're doing to protect young children and young people away from structured times, such as that school bus or the unstructured time as they move around corridors in between the schools. This statement really shocked me and distressed me, really, which is where the girls aged 12 and 13 told inspectors that they felt uncomfortable walking through town centres in their school uniform, that they were called sexist names, and there was a range of sexual advances made to them. Again, a further reminder of the importance of sharing with our young people key messages around safety in all contexts and not just within the school gates. Turning to how school leaders saw the issue, senior teachers, including DSLs, the inspectors felt had a more accurate understanding than staff in general around sexual violence, harassment, online sexual abuse, and more broader peer-on-peer abuse. As we move into September and we get the opportunity to speak to all staff across the trust about safeguarding again, making sure that that focus area around peer abuse is beyond present is going to be a really important factor of that safeguarding training in that area. They said as well that some teachers, governors, and even local safeguarding partnerships said that it wasn't an issue in their area or in their school, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And then finally in this area, they said that there was a lack of confidence in teaching RSE, meaning that in many schools, the issues of consent, healthy relationships, and the use of sexual imagery were just not covered enough within the curriculum, which in itself was limiting young people's understandings of the risk and the support pathways that are there in that area. Now, this is a statement for me that really stuck out, and it's something that we've seen as well appear in the new Ofsted inspection handbook, and it builds on that statement from their report where they said about how some teachers and local safeguarding partnerships didn't feel that this was an issue for them. Ofsted say, and this is a really powerful message, that even without specific information, schools should act on the assumption that sexual harassment and online sexual abuse are a problem. We need to be really clear about that. Even if we don't have the data to support it, let's assume it happens and let's ensure that there's a whole school approach to that. As I said at the beginning, one of the questions was around Ofsted itself, how it performs its inspections and how much of the time in inspections is focused in on sexual violence and sexual harassment data. Since 2019, schools have been asked to provide to inspectors on arrival at 8 a.m. a record of analysis in relation to the data covering sexual harassment and sexual violence. 48% of schools that inspectors visited since then didn't have any data at all to present to inspectors. 46% of schools shared that data, but didn't actually have any data at all to produce. And only 6% of schools had evidence to show inspectors of the work that they have done to analyse that data. In the majority of cases, inspectors did not follow this up, didn't follow up to ask why there was no data, didn't follow up to ask why their data was so bland, or didn't follow up where schools had data and start to triangulate that through case records and speaking with staff and young people across the school. I think it's safe to say that in the future, this will absolutely be followed up by inspectors, and rightly so. And when we have inspections in the future, we are so much more likely to see this type of data being analysed by inspectors. In the report as well, it also touched on the harmful sexual behaviour continuum, which essentially is it's a document by Hackett as part of their research into young people and sexual violence and children behaving badly. And it's a table that explores peer violence between children and young people. It's been present in Keeping Children Safe in Education in part 5 and the government's sexual violence advice to school leaders as well. It's always been there. But what inspectors found was that very rarely did school leaders use this tool to be able to align sexualized behaviors with the tool to work out how risks might be kind of escalating or any emerging risks that are coming out of the behaviors in young people. I think as we move forward in this area, this is certainly something on my reflection that we need to include more in our training to both safeguarding leaders, but also to staff as well, so that they themselves can start to be a bit more kind of pick out more broader themes of harm rather than the more obvious indicators of abuse that we've told about in the past. Inspectors also picked out on the question around guidance that they felt there was insufficient guidance for incidents that occurred outside of school and for when schools are supporting young people that are subject to police investigations, especially those that resulted in no further action. And for me, that's a really kind of key point that they picked out there, because school leaders do struggle with that idea of having to support a child where the referral's been made into the police, has been so much action from disclosure to referral, and then all of a sudden everything massively slows down. What the DFE have recognised and what Ofsted are recognising this is that window there between making that report to the police and the conclusion of the police investigation, there needs to be far more guidance in there to support school leaders, signpost them towards different support channels, and to help them respond to the kind of, at times, alas, realities that so few sexual violence cases are being prosecuted at the moment. For me, a self-reflection point in that area is that I think that there is probably a lot more work to be done in this area that stretches beyond education, and maybe there is an opportunity as a result of this report to now turn to the criminal justice system and see what additional support can be put in place there to maximise the opportunities for prosecution where such referrals are made by young people. Turning to training then, staff told inspectors that safeguarding training at the time was a bit piecemeal, that staff training around peer-on-peer abuse was not based in the reality of children's experiences. staff were just told to go away and read the guidance. Also found that 75% of governing bodies had no safeguarding training whatsoever. I think when we reflect on this, it's important that we make sure that our training is more than just be telling someone to read guidance. Of course, in our trust, we have gone that little bit further. We make sure that staff receive peer-on-peer abuse training in September, and then further bespoke training in that area throughout the year. It's certainly something we're going to develop more, and we're looking for additional kind of opportunities to enhance the learning experience of our staff when it comes to responding to peer-on-peer abuse, and rightly so. So at the end of their report, then, Ofsted make a range of recommendations. They talk about the need, as we said at the beginning, for better RSE teaching around sexual harassment and violence, including online abuse. They speak about the need for schools to reinforce a culture where sexual harassment and online sexual abuse is not tolerated. They say that schools and local safeguarding partners need to work better together to increase the ability of information sharing, and for where schools do share information, to increase the visibility of social workers that are involved in case management, so that schools know what to expect, they know the current status of support, and know what part they can play in that wider multi-agency work. They've said that there needs to be more routine record keeping analysis of sexual harassment and sexual violence, including online harm. And that, again, is certainly something that we need to build on. All our DSLs provide their 8 AM documents at quality assurance visits and to Ofsted inspectors. But for me, those documents need to be working documents, something that's reviewed regularly, discussed at governors meetings, discussed at trust board meetings, and most importantly, discussed within senior leadership team meetings, so that actions can follow promptly and schools can respond dynamically to any emerging risks in this area. And then finally, in this area as well, there's a need to support our DSLs, including making sure they have appropriate time to undertake their role. Keeping Children Safe in Education since about 2010 has told us that DSLs need to have appropriate time, resources, support, and power, essentially, to undertake their role. I think this is a solid reminder of the need to reflect on the amount of time DSLs have to undertake their work and make sure that they have that space and autonomy and the resources to do it properly. And then finally, turning to staff training, doing more of what we're doing today, sharing information when it comes out, disseminating the findings of reports and research, but most importantly, giving our school leaders the skills and the ability to be able to reflect on safeguarding standards and to reflect on safeguarding practice across the trust. Finally, they also highlighted some good practice as well in the report. They spoke about spotting some really good practice in schools' work around when schools are dealing with small group discussions, proactively tackling that no snitch culture, and seeking to map out hotspots across their school. A piece of work Bilton are doing at the moment is around this idea of technologizing, if you will, the student voice platform, giving pupils an opportunity to tell leaders how safe and unsafe they feel in certain different parts of the school. They also said as well that good practice that came out of their findings was that where pupils had a trusting relationship with one specific member of staff, where they'd had a positive experience of a school's response to a safeguarding concern or peer-on-peer abuse, and also where teachers showed that they respected the students, that they would listen to students and they would respond to their concerns and their anxieties, that pupils are more likely to share information with school staff and make more reports and so on in this area. Finally, in that area, they spoke about the need to or how much more they preferred to deal with staff who didn't necessarily have a specialist role in pastoral care. A lot of pupils spoke about how when they do report concerns in this area, it's often the head of year that would deal with the scenario, and that they felt that as the head of year would tend to deal with behaviour things, that actually they themselves would be dealing with it through a kind of punitive angle, and they felt that that was at times a barrier to reporting. Certainly something for senior teams to reflect on. And then finally, as we draw to a close, the final recommendations that Ofsted made were around making sure that pupil and staff perception of online sexual abuse, sexual violence is aligned, not relying on pupils to report, going back to that point we were saying earlier about assuming that sexual violence and sexual harassment takes place in schools, and making sure that we are acting proactively to assume that there is this concern emerging within our corridors, and we're taking that whole school approach through things like changing the narrative groups, proactive strategies for raising awareness, and through the development of effective RSHE schemes of work. We're able then to really start to turn the tide on this and give our young people the opportunity to respond appropriately. So finally then, what can we do next? What are our next steps? Well, there's a few suggestions here for you to have a think about with your governing bodies, but certainly to review the RSE curriculum should be top of school leaders' lists as they go into the new academic year. As a trust, as we do, we will make sure that the policies are detailed in this area and that they cover the legal framework, but also give the scope to school leaders to contextualize those policies to ensure that they capture everything that needs to be captured in terms of giving them the power and giving young people the power to be able to report and respond appropriately to sexual harms. Finally, and I'm not going to go through each one individually, but I think it's really important that we take the opportunity, whilst it is a national discussion, to speak with our children and young people to get an accurate feel for what this harm looks like for them. As we say in all areas of safeguarding, it's really important that we understand the context of a young person. What does it feel like to be a young person living in Southam, attending Southam College, living in Rugby and going to Bilton, Kyneton and Kyneton and so on? What does it feel like to be a child on that school bus, walking to and from school, walking through the town centre? Where we understand what it feels like to be a young person, we're able to put in place proactive measures to prevent harm and to give our young people the best possible opportunities to report concern when it happens. In my final slide then, I just want to draw your attention to these next 5 steps, 5 things that I think you can do straight away. And the first one is to make sure that you understand the school's context and that leaders properly understand the school's context as well. As I say, what does it feel like to be a young person in that school? Because where you understand that, you're able to update your school policies, make sure they're contextualized, and make sure they accurately capture both the national picture and also the local context as well. Ensure staff understand not just this report, but they understand the signs and indicators of abuse in this area. They understand what the school is doing to develop that whole school approach, and they understand what processes to follow if they feel that a child needs support in this area. School leaders need to be developing their pupil curriculum, reflecting, conducting deep dives on the RSHE curriculum, understanding, speaking to young people about what that piece of work looks like and feels like to them, and what the impact of that curriculum is on their development as we strive to allow them to flourish both in school and in society. And then finally, I just want to end on this final point, which is making sure that people know how to report. When we decided as a trust that we was going to launch our approach to sexual violence and harassment, we went out and spoke to young people as we felt that we needed to develop a headline, a tagline for it, if you will. And we'd come up with it's not tolerated or it's not okay. And it was actually only when we spoke to a group of year 10 girls at Southam College that we spoke to them and said, look, this is what we want as a title. And one of the girls said, well, it doesn't really matter what your title is, so long as you get one more report from it, then that is enough. Someone else is speaking out, someone else is being protected, and some prevention is taking place to stop some sort of harm in this area. So to end, my challenge to you would be, what are you going to do in your schools to get one more report? Thank you ever so much for listening. As always, I will give a cheeky plug to Safeguarding Days, which you can listen to on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And there's going to be a range of podcasts across the summer holidays around peer-on-peer abuse and sexual violence to, again, further increase visibility in this area. Thank you ever so much for listening. If you've got any questions, please fire them in an email across to myself or Peter Robinson, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much for your time. Take care.